What happens when a CEO realizes his company's success is built on the backs of employees he's never actually met. Daniel, the founder and CEO of a growing chain of 3 warehouses, had heard whispers of trouble, delays in shipments, rising employee turnover, and a surge in customer complaints. His managers assured him everything was under control, but Daniel wasn't convinced. Reports and numbers couldn't tell him what was really happening on the ground. Frustrated, he decided to do something drastic. He would go undercover as a new hire to see the truth for himself. With a trimmed beard, glasses, and dyed hair, Daniel looked nothing like the clean-cut CEO whose face only appeared on corporate newsletters. None of the warehouse employees had ever met him personally. His time was spent managing the company from a distance. He used a fake name, Mark, and signed up for a 2-week training shift at the company's busiest warehouse. The morning he arrived, the scene was chaos. Trucks lined up outside, workers darting around with forklifts, and a loudspeaker barking instructions over the din. The warehouse manager, Eric, barely glanced at him as he handed Daniel a fluorescent vest. "You're the new guy, great. Stick with Sarah, she'll show you the ropes," Eric said, already turning away to bark orders at another employee. Sarah, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gave him a quick nod. "Come on, Mark, hope you're ready to sweat." The first few hours were a blur. Daniel found himself loading boxes onto pallets, scanning barcodes, and rushing to keep up with Sarah's pace. She didn't talk much, but she worked like a machine, barely stopping to take a sip of water. Around him, other workers seemed equally rushed, their faces tense and focused. Daniel noticed something odd. There were only a handful of employees on the floor, far fewer than he'd expected for a warehouse this size. "Is it always this busy?" he asked Sarah during a rare pause. She shot him a look that was half amused, half exhausted. This is a slow day. Wait until the weekend rush hits. You'd better get used to it." By noon, Daniel's muscles ached and he was drenched in sweat. He saw Sarah glance at the clock and then at him. "Lunch break," she said curtly. "You've earned it." As they walked toward the break room, Daniel noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. Near the far end of the warehouse, a young man in his early 20s was struggling to lift a large box onto a cart. His face was red with effort, and he looked like he might collapse at any moment. Daniel froze, unsure of what to do. No one else seemed to notice or care. "Hey, is he okay?" Daniel asked Sarah, pointing toward the worker. She sighed, her expression darkening. "That's Louis. He's new, like you. Management doesn't care if you're drowning as long as the job gets done. He's probably trying to keep up so he doesn't get yelled at." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. "That can't be normal," Sarah shrugged. "It is here." Without thinking, Daniel walked over to Louis. "Hey, need a hand?" Louis looked up, startled. Yeah, thanks." His voice trailed off as Daniel helped him lift the box onto the cart. Louis muttered a quiet thanks before hurrying off, clearly embarrassed. Sarah watched from a distance, her arms crossed. When Daniel rejoined her, she gave him a small, approving nod. "You're not like most new guys. They usually just look the other way." Daniel didn't respond. His mind was racing. This wasn't just a hiccup or a one-off issue. Something was seriously wrong here. And he was starting to suspect it went deeper than overworked employees. But for now, he played along, determined to keep his cover intact. As he sat in the break room later, eating a sandwich and listening to the workers talk about their lives, he quietly observed. The jokes were tinged with frustration, the laughter felt forced, and the complaints were frequent but hushed, as if they feared being overheard. Daniel realized this wasn't just a bad day. This was the culture, and it was a culture he was responsible for. The next day, Daniel arrived early, hoping to get a better sense of the operation before the morning rush began. He lingered by the loading docks, watching as trucks were unloaded and pallets were stacked. Workers shuffled in, some yawning, others already looking worn out before the day had even started. He noticed Sarah arriving, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face drawn. She nodded at him briefly before heading toward her station. The energy in the warehouse shifted as Eric, the manager, entered. His booming voice cut through the air as he barked orders and snapped at those who weren't moving quickly enough. Daniel noticed how the workers stiffened whenever Eric approached, their movements sharper and more frantic. The tension was palpable, and Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "Mark." "Hey, new guy," Eric hollered, motioning him over. Daniel jogged over, trying to appear eager. "Yes, sir. You're with Lewis today. We're short-staffed again, so you two are covering Zone 3. Don't fall behind or I'll hear about it." He clapped Daniel on the shoulder, the gesture more forceful than friendly, and walked off without waiting for a response. Daniel found Lewis near a stack of crates, his face already slick with sweat despite the morning chill. He was adjusting his gloves, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey, looks like we're teamed up," Daniel said, offering a small smile. Lewis nodded but didn't say much, his eyes darting toward the clock on the far wall. "We've got to move fast. This zone's a mess." As they worked, Daniel quickly realized Lewis wasn't exaggerating. The area was disorganized, with boxes stacked haphazardly and pallets missing labels. Every few minutes, Lewis would glance around nervously, as if expecting Eric to appear out of nowhere. "You okay?" Daniel asked after noticing Lewis rub his shoulder for the third time. Lewis hesitated, then shrugged. "Just sore. It's been like this every day since I started. No time to rest, you know," Daniel frowned. "Have you told anyone?" "Maybe they could," Lewis cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Told who?" "Eric. He'd just tell me to suck it up or find another job." People don't last here long for a reason. Before Daniel could respond, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Both he and Lewis turned to see Sarah standing near a toppled stack of boxes, her face pale. Eric was already storming over, his expression thunderous. "What the hell is this, Sarah?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the warehouse. Workers nearby stopped what they were doing, their eyes flicking between Sarah and Eric. I lost my grip," Sarah stammered, her hands trembling. "It was an accident." "An accident? Do you have any idea how much time this is going to waste?" "Clean it up now, and if you screw up again today, you're out of here," Eric spat, his face inches from hers. Daniel felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay quiet. He couldn't blow his cover yet, not without understanding the full scope of the problem. As Eric stormed away, Sarah knelt to pick up the scattered boxes, her movements stiff and mechanical. Daniel glanced at Lewis, who looked just as uncomfortable. "I'll help her," Daniel said quietly. Lewis nodded, his relief evident. "I'll keep working here, just don't let Eric see you." Daniel approached Sarah and crouched beside her. "Let me give you a hand." She looked up, startled, then shook her head. "You'll get in trouble." "I'll take my chances," Daniel said, reaching for a box. For a moment, Sarah hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "Thanks." As they worked together to clean up the mess, Daniel noticed the dark circles under Sarah's eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly when she lifted the heavier boxes. "Do you get any breaks around here?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Sarah gave him a wry smile. "Breaks? Sure, if you count the 5 minutes it takes to inhale a granola bar before someone yells at you to get back to work." Daniel's frustration grew with every passing moment. He'd built this company to provide opportunities, to create a workplace people could be proud of. Yet here he was, surrounded by exhausted employees who seemed more like cogs in a machine than valued team members. By the end of the day, Daniel's body ached, but it was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. As he left the warehouse, he saw Lewis sitting alone on a bench outside, his head in his hands. Daniel hesitated, then walked over. "Hey, long day, huh?" Lewis looked up, startled, then nodded. "Yeah. They all are." "You know," Daniel began carefully, "if things are this rough, maybe you could talk to someone higher up, like corporate." Lewis let out a humorless laugh. "Corporate doesn't care about us, they don't even know we exist, we're just numbers to them." Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He wanted to tell Lewis he was wrong, that corporate did care, that he cared, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he clapped Lewis on the shoulder and said, "Hang in there. Things can't stay like this forever." As he walked to his car, Daniel's mind raced. He'd seen enough to know things were worse than he'd imagined, but he also knew he couldn't fix it overnight. He needed a plan, a way to not only address the immediate problems but to create lasting change. For now, though, he had to keep his cover. Tomorrow he would dig deeper. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake replaying the day's events in his mind. The fear in Lewis's voice, the exhaustion etched on Sarah's face, and Eric's explosive temper, it all painted a picture he couldn't ignore. These were his people, and they were drowning in a system he'd built, but had allowed others to manage unchecked. He had to dig deeper. The next morning, Daniel clocked in early again, blending in with the workers as they shuffled in for another grueling day. He joined Lewis in Zone 3, but today he made a point to observe more than just the tasks. He watched how the workflow was managed or mismanaged. By mid-morning, he noticed something strange. Eric had been making his rounds, barking orders as usual, but he wasn't sticking around to ensure things ran smoothly. Instead, he kept disappearing into his office for long stretches. At one point, Daniel saw Eric emerge with a mug in hand, laughing at something on his phone before heading back inside. Meanwhile, Lewis was struggling to pull a heavy pallet across the floor by himself. "Hold on, Lewis," Daniel said, stepping in to help. Lewis looked up, sweating and out of breath. "Thanks, man. I swear, this place just gets worse every day. We're supposed to have 3 people on this zone, but it's always just me." "Where's Eric?" Daniel asked casually, though his tone carried a sharper edge than he intended. Lewis gave a bitter laugh. "Probably in his office. That's where he spends most of his time. He only comes out to yell at us or pretend to look busy when corporate visits." Daniel felt his fists clench but said nothing. He helped Lewis finish the pallet, then excused himself, saying he needed to grab more gloves from the supply room. Instead, he made his way toward Eric's office, careful to avoid drawing attention. Peering through the small window on the door, Daniel saw Eric sitting at his desk, scrolling on his phone with his feet propped up. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. Papers were scattered across the desk, but none of them looked like they'd been touched in hours. Daniel forced himself to walk away before his anger got the better of him. He needed more than just observations, he needed proof. Later that day, during lunch, Daniel finally got the chance to talk with Sarah again. She was sitting alone in the break room, staring at her sandwich but not eating. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, setting his tray down across from her. She looked up, surprised, then shrugged. "Sure, not much of a lunch, though." Daniel unwrapped his sandwich, deciding to ease into the conversation. "How long have you been here, Sarah?" "Almost 4 years," she said, her voice flat. "That's a long time. You must like it here then." Sarah gave a short, humorless laugh. "Like it? No, but I don't have a choice. I've got 2 kids at home and bills to pay." "This job's all I've got." Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. "That's tough. Do you at least feel like you're treated fairly?" Her eyes flicked toward the door, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Look, Mark, you're new, so let me give you some advice. Keep your head down, do your work, and don't make waves. Eric doesn't care about us, he only cares about looking good to corporate. If you cross him, you're out." Daniel leaned back, processing her words. "What about corporate? Have they ever come down here to see how things are run?" Sarah shook her head. Once, maybe twice a year. And when they do, Eric makes sure everything looks perfect. We get extra help for the day, and he actually pretends to care. But as soon as they leave, it's back to the same old mess. Before Daniel could respond, the lunch bell rang, signaling the end of the break. Sarah stood up, tossing her uneaten sandwich in the trash. Good luck, Mark, you'll need it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of heavy lifting and rushed tasks. Daniel kept his head down, but his mind was racing, piecing together everything he'd learned. By the time his shift ended, he had a plan. That evening, Daniel called his head of HR, a woman named Linda who had been with the company since its inception. She was one of the few people he trusted completely. "Linda, I need you to visit the warehouse tomorrow," he said, his voice firm. "Why, what's going on?" Linda asked, concerned. "I can't explain everything over the phone, but I need you to do an unannounced audit. Talk to the workers, review the schedules, and check Eric's performance records. I've got a strong feeling he's been hiding things from us." Linda hesitated, then said, "All right. I'll be there first thing in the morning." The next day, Daniel showed up for his shift as usual, but this time he was ready. As the workers clocked in, he noticed them buzzing with curiosity. Word had spread that someone from corporate was on site. Linda arrived mid-morning, clipboard in hand, her sharp eyes scanning the warehouse. Eric, clearly caught off guard, rushed over to greet her. "Linda, what a surprise," he said, his tone overly cheerful. "If I'd known you were coming, I would have prepared a proper welcome." "That's the point, Eric," Linda replied coolly. "I'm here for an unannounced audit. Let's start with your office." Daniel watched from a distance as Linda followed Eric into his office. The door closed behind them, but through the window, he could see Linda pointing to various papers on Eric's desk, her expression growing increasingly stern. An hour later, Linda emerged, her face set in a hard line. She began speaking with workers individually, taking notes and asking questions. When she reached Sarah, Daniel saw Sarah glance nervously toward Eric's office before answering Linda's questions. By the end of the day, Linda had seen enough. She called an all-hands meeting in the break room, her voice cutting through the chatter as she addressed the workers. "Effective immediately, Eric has been placed on suspension pending further investigation," Linda announced. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Daniel stood in the back, silently watching as Linda continued. "We've identified several issues with how this warehouse has been managed, and we're taking steps to fix them. You'll see changes starting tomorrow." As the workers filed out, Daniel caught Sarah's eye. She gave him a small, tentative smile, her first real smile since he'd met her. He wasn't done yet. The reveal would come soon. But for now, he was satisfied knowing that the first cracks in the old system had finally appeared. By the next morning, the warehouse was buzzing with speculation. Eric's suspension had sent shockwaves through the team, and the workers were cautiously optimistic about what might come next. Daniel, still undercover as Mark, could feel the shift in the air. People moved with a bit more energy, their conversations laced with hope. But he knew one suspension wasn't enough. There were still deeper issues to fix, and it was time to reveal himself. Daniel waited until the afternoon after the lunch break to make his move. He approached Linda, who had returned to the warehouse to oversee operations for the day. She was standing near the loading docks, clipboard in hand, speaking with one of the supervisors. At the sight of Daniel, she raised an eyebrow, recognizing him even through his well-crafted disguise. "Linda," he said quietly, motioning for her to step aside. She followed him to a quiet corner of the warehouse out of earshot of the workers. "I'm ready," Daniel said firmly. "It's time I told them who I am." Linda studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Are you sure? It's going to be a big moment." "They deserve to know the truth," Daniel replied. And I need them to see that I'm serious about making things right. Linda agreed to gather everyone in the break room for an announcement. The workers filed in slowly, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Sarah and Louis sat together near the back, whispering to each other. Others leaned against the walls, arms crossed, waiting to see what this was all about. Daniel stood at the front of the room, still in his disguise, his heart pounding. For a moment, he hesitated. What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought this was just another corporate stunt? But then he remembered Louis struggling alone, Sarah's exhaustion, and the workers' quiet desperation. He owed it to them to step up. Linda cleared her throat, silencing the room. Everyone, I'd like to introduce someone very important. This is Daniel, the CEO of the company. The room went dead silent. All eyes turned to Daniel, who removed his glasses and ran a hand through his dyed hair, revealing his true appearance. There were gasps, murmurs, and a few stunned stares. Louis blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what he was seeing. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Hi, everyone," Daniel began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I know this is a shock. For the past week, I've been working here undercover to see what life is really like in this warehouse. I wanted to understand the challenges you face every day, and I've seen more than I ever expected." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room remained silent, but the tension was thick. "I want to start by apologizing," Daniel continued. "When I started this company, I had a vision of creating a workplace where people felt valued and respected. But somewhere along the way, I lost touch with what was happening on the ground. That's on me, and I take full responsibility." A hand shot up near the back of the room. It was Louis. "So, all this time you were watching us, listening to us." His tone wasn't angry, but there was a hint of betrayal. Daniel nodded. "Yes, I was. And I want to thank you for being honest with me, even when you didn't know who I was. I've learned a lot from you and from everyone here. That's why I'm here today, to make things right." He turned to Linda, who handed him a stack of papers. "First, I want to address the staffing issues. Starting next week, we're hiring additional workers to ensure no one is overburdened. Louis, you should never have had to handle Zone 3 alone." "That ends now." Louis's jaw dropped slightly, but he nodded, his face softening. "Second," Daniel continued, "we're implementing new policies to ensure fair treatment for all employees. That includes regular breaks, improved scheduling, and an open-door policy for reporting concerns. No one should feel afraid to speak up." Daniel's eyes scanned the room, landing on Sarah. "Sarah, you've been here for 4 years and you've given everything to this job. I've seen your dedication firsthand. Starting today, I'm promoting you to shift supervisor. You'll have the authority to make decisions on the floor and ensure the team is treated with respect." Sarah's mouth fell open. "Me? Are you serious?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Absolutely," Daniel said with a smile. "You've earned it." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to maintain her composure. The room erupted in applause, the workers cheering loudly for her. "And one more thing," Daniel added, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. "To show my appreciation for all your hard work, everyone here is getting a bonus this month. It's the least I can do for everything you've endured." The cheers grew louder, and for the first time, Daniel saw genuine smiles on the faces of his employees. The weight in the room seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and excitement. As the meeting ended and the workers began to disperse, many of them approached Daniel to shake his hand or thank him. Louis clapped him on the back, grinning. "You really had us fooled, man. But I'm glad you did what you did." Sarah lingered near the front, still holding the papers Linda had handed her. She looked at Daniel, her expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. You've earned it," Daniel replied. And Sarah, if you ever feel like something isn't right, I want you to tell me. Directly. No more barriers, she nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I will. As Daniel left the warehouse that evening, he felt a sense of relief and determination. The changes wouldn't happen overnight, but they were a start. For the first time in years, he felt connected to his company and the people who made it run. And he knew he would never let himself lose that connection again.